After a whole month of the Mac Studios being out, Apple finally updated Final Cut Pro, and with that, Adobe also updated Premiere Pro, and Davinci Resolve was released, the latest update, not long ago. So we can finally make our ultimate video editing comparison, including 3 of these Mac Studios, starting with the $2,000 base model, the $4,000 mid-spec, and the top-level performance, which has 128 gigs of RAM and the 64-core graphics. Now, I tested out a bunch of different codecs, different tests, raw graphics performance when it comes to video editing, encoding speeds, timeline smoothness, how much video streams could be handled. This is the most comprehensive test out there to help you decide if you should buy one of these Mac Studios, and then which specifications and configurations you should get. And trust me, this is going to get interesting. Let's go ahead and jump in, and I'm only gonna have a couple benchmarks because I'm gonna focus on real world performance, but I need to set the stage. When we test out Geekbench 5 as far as metal, we see that there is not that big of a difference in terms of performance. Now, we have discovered that Geekbench, it does not utilize all of these GPUs. A lot of the time, they're just sitting there waiting for work to come in. So this actual performance is not valid. If it was working properly, it would look similar to GFX Bench Metal, where we go from 241 frames per second all the way to 484. Now, you guys may see that we don't get complete proper scaling, and that was to be expected a little bit, but there are some disappointments. Now, another test that uses metal is Blackmagic's RAW playback test. Here we have 200 frames per second for the M1 Max 24 core, and then going up to 314 for the 48 core. Now, it has double the graphics core, so it should be 400, right? Well, no, we're not getting that scaling, but then spending an extra $1,000 for the 64 core model, we get actually 307. I tested this multiple times, it actually went down a little bit. Now, these scores are very impressive. For example, our $5,000 iMac Pro only runs at 107 frames per second, showing you just how much of a leap even the base Mac Studio is. Now, unfortunately, the highest end ones, well, they're supposed to run at 400, and then maybe somewhere around 500 or so if the scaling was proper, but they don't. Now, this is where I have to say, once again, just because an application is optimized for Apple Silicon, it's ARM-based, doesn't mean that it's completely optimized for these new graphics chips, and even the M1, the tile memory, the way it's set up for maximum efficiency. And Davinci Resolve has actually done a killer job, as you guys will see, optimizing, but there is more room to go. And well, that 64 core, it's interesting. Now, when an application or task is fully optimized, for example, denoising raw video in Davinci Resolve, this is the difference that you can expect. We get 12 frames per second playback, and this is really tough denoising, both temporal and spatial, for the M1 Max 24 core, jump up to 16 for the 48, and then we jump up to 20 for the 64. Now, once again, you know, the mid-spec $4,000 one, it should get double the performance, and we're not seeing that. We're going from 12 to 16, and this is something that is fully optimized, and this shows you the raw graphics power as it relates to video editing, which is why I love this test. So if you're gonna buy an M1 Ultra, and if you decide to wait for optimizations in the future, know that you will not get perfect scaling for what you're paying for, and this is just the truth. Now, jumping into video editing, I'm gonna start out with stabilizing a 1-minute 4K clip, and here in Final Cut, it is insanely fast. It is so fast, in fact, and so optimized that it is limited by the decoders for this footage. Now, Premiere Pro, it's almost identical, as you guys see. That's because it's only using the CPU, and it's only using roughly 25% of it. It uses no graphics, so that is terrible. Now, as far as Davinci Resolve, yes, we do see some improvement, but nothing like you would expect, and this does use 100% GPU power. It's not limited, it is optimized. So there you guys go, that's the difference you get for spending close to 3 times as much money. Now, as far as editing and exporting your regular H.264 4K footage, you see those times are so close and they are identical between the different Mac models. That is just because this footage is so easy that the extra power gives you nothing. It literally improves nothing. Now, some people will say, well, maybe you'll get extra timeline smoothness, so we're gonna talk about that a lot. Well, in fact, I put in my toughest H.264 test where there's 4 4K videos in a 4K timeline with LUTs and film grain applied multiple LUTs. We have color corrections, 2 are reversed, and they play back perfectly smoothly. I literally stopped using this test for years after I created it because systems would just crash or play back at 1 to 2 frames per second if they were very powerful. And here it's playing back perfectly and only using 75% of the GPU, meaning there's an extra 15% for more footage or more effects. And this is with the $2,000 base Mac Studio, which is incredible. Now, when you're actually editing a timeline, there is so much more overhead for effects. And if we're switching over to H.265, which is a more modern codec, well, here the export times are quite a bit faster, and Davinci Resolve is actually by far the fastest. They've done the most optimizations. So this is kind of the way to go forward. Now, when you are exporting this, and even though it's exporting at about, I don't know, I think it's 150, 170 frames per second, you are still only using 79% of the graphics power, and that is in the $2,000 M1 Max. Now, the M1 Ultras, they do have more overhead, but not as big of a difference as I would expect, because if we're using about 80% for the M1 Max, I would think doubling the graphics cores would allow us to only use 40%, but you guys can see that is not the case. Now, when we are in the timeline and we are editing, everything is nice and smooth. No matter, even if you stack, a lot of effects and color corrections, it works super well in all of these programs. Now, some people say, well, what about multicam? Well, I actually took 15 4K streams, put it in a 4K timeline, and they each had their own color corrections and multiple LUTs, and that's how much it took in order to use 95% of the graphics. That is just incredible. It blew my mind. So I wish I had a system like this back like maybe 3 years ago when I stopped doing wedding filmmaking and editing multicam. I mean, it is just so smooth, just proving that with this footage, you do not need to have an M1 Ultra. Now, some people do say that there are dropped frames in titles and animation, especially with plugins, and that is true. But guess what? It still happens with the M1 Ultra as well. That's just because the plugins aren't optimized yet. There's glitches and bugs, and it is really annoying. But it doesn't mean that if you buy an M1 Ultra, it's gonna solve that issue. That was still there. People have to update their plugins. Now, as far as Canon R5 422 10-bit footage, this is what makes my $15,000 Mac Pro choke up. Same thing with previous Intel Macs. Well, this footage plays just as well as other easy 4K footage. It is incredible. As far as smoothness, I wanted to stack as much effects as I could to get it to slow down. So I literally stacked 10 LUTs on there, regular color correction. I did white balance adjustments, hue to hue, and it literally played back at like 75 or 77% GPU usage. It didn't even max it out, perfectly smooth. And that is coming from about 43% before. Not a big jump with all those effects. And then I stacked on top of it another layer with masking, with animated text, and that was still only 83% graphics usage, and that is with the base M1 Max. It is crazy. Now, when we're exporting this footage, this is crazy. You guys see it takes 2 minutes for a 5-minute project for all of these, literally all of them. And I actually tested this out using ProRes as well, and we were limited. And that just tells me that with this particular codec, we are actually limited by the decoders that work with this footage. That also means that no, you will not be able to have 15 streams of 4K 10-bit 422. You're gonna be more limited to about, I think about 6 to 7, which is still incredible. So realistically, for all this footage, it is just crazy. The M1 Max is amazing and you are not going to miss out. Now, as far as raw footage, well, this is where you start getting some extra benefit from the Ultra and the extra graphics and, especially in some tests, the CPU power. I tested out Blackmagic RAW. This is 6K in Davinci Resolve with color corrections and multiple LUTs. And this is where the M1 Ultra starts to come in. You guys see the exporting is quite a bit quicker. This is a 5-minute project as well. Not twice as fast, but closer. And what really stands out to me is the fact that this is GPU limited. It's raw, using all of the performance, being maximized really well, but the 64 core still doesn't perform much better than the 48. And when we are in the timeline, this Blackmagic RAW is extremely smooth. It is so smooth. And as far as the GPU usage, our M1 Max uses 39% for 6K with color corrections in multiple LUTs, and we go down to 25 for the 48 core and only 21 for the 64. So the 64, 50% more cores, but they're still being used a lot as far as the total usage. We're not getting that much extra performance here or overhead for extra effects. Now, what this means is that the base model can handle 2 streams of 6K Blackmagic RAW with effects and corrections, or about 5 streams if you're using 4K. That is really good. And then if you lower your resolution or your playback or your multicam with everything full screen, it can actually do more than that. The Ultra, it won't be able to do double, but it will be able to do close to that. So you guys can make your decision for this codec with this program that's very well optimized for this. And for example, the 64 core, definitely I would not be spending the extra for that. And now let's get into some even tougher tests. Testing out Canon 4K Cinema RAW Lite, this is where stuff gets crazy and we start seeing some massive differences, both in the systems and also the programs. Now, I exported a 5-minute project and I want to reiterate that I'm using these shorter projects and I'm spending so much time, days, benchmarking, and with these systems, none of them have any throttling or slowdown. So you can literally take your project, say you work on 15-minute projects, and just triple these times to see how much time you will save. Now, Premiere Pro is slow, as you guys see, much slower than Final Cut, and then Davinci Resolve is incredibly fast. This just shows us how these programs deal with this footage. And for example, instead of buying an M1 Ultra, you can literally switch from Premiere Pro, go to Davinci Resolve, and the base Max Studio will be literally twice as fast. And unlike our previous compressed codec tests, here the export times also show you how this footage performs when you're editing and how many streams you can use. For example, the reason Premiere is so slow is because it is limited by the CPU, not the graphics, which is why the faster 64 core M1 Ultra, it doesn't really give you any benefits. Now, as far as that playback in Premiere, the base model only plays back at 17 frames per second. And then if you get the M1 Ultra with the 20 core CPU, you go up to 36 frames per second, meaning you can only play back 1 stream of this footage, either 24 or 30 FPS, with some basic color corrections, a LUT, and have proper performance. You can't do any better than that without having to make some sort of compromises. Now, in Final Cut, even the base model can play back at up to 60 frames per second. And then the weird thing is upgrading, you don't get that much more performance. So keep that in mind if you use Final Cut. But in Davinci Resolve, look at the optimizations that they made. That is incredible. I just want to, just clap for the Davinci Resolve team. But with that, I still don't think it's worth spending the extra $1,000 for the 64 core M1 Ultra. And with that, let's switch to 8K Canon RAW. This is less compressed here. And in Davinci Resolve, the M1 Ultras can actually play this back perfectly in 8K with a LUT applied in color corrections. Now in Final Cut, it does not play it back perfectly. It does so smooth, but of course you can lower down to a worse quality. Just like that in Davinci Resolve, you can also go down to a 4K timeline, and then even the M1 Max will play it back. But for Premiere Pro, even the M1 Ultra can only play this back at 4 frames per second and 2 frames per second for the Max Studio. Once again showing if you can change from Premiere to Resolve, you will have much bigger improvements than upgrading to the highest end Mac Studio. Now, as far as export times, we see pretty linear scaling going from the M1 Max to the M1 Ultra. But with that, the 64-core Ultra model doesn't really get much faster than the 48-core, and that is because we are actually limited by the CPU. And I would just say, for this kind of footage, I think that the $4,000 Mac Studio is a perfect sweet spot because you get a lot of improvements compared to the base model. Now, for those of you guys that work with ProRes or ProRes RAW, I have multiple tests for you. First off, I have to say for the ProRes RAW, we're only using Final Cut and Premiere Pro because Davinci Resolve does not support it, unfortunately. But the performance of these programs, it's amazing, super smooth. Even for the RAW with LUTs, color corrections, effects, it is incredible. And exporting a 5-minute project, it just flies with all these systems. Now, one trend that I am seeing is that you don't get that much more performance for the M1 Ultra because there's dedicated decoders that are taking the load off of the CPU and graphics. So all of that extra, performance is just there for effects. Now, Final Cut is a lot more efficient. It uses a lot less GPU power. You have a lot more overhead, but with that, I mean, both are still super fast. Now, switching over to 8K ProRes RAW to ProRes 444XQ, here I just used Final Cut, and once again, you see that the times are so similar here, and that just shows me that because of these specific decoders, the ProRes hardware that Apple built in that is for free in here, they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot because even the base Mac Studio is so incredibly quick. Even with 8K ProRes RAW, it is crazy. And in fact, it can handle about 4 streams of 8K ProRes RAW, or maybe about 5 to 6 of 8K ProRes. It is insane, and that's the base model. Now, as far as just regular ProRes, that is just so easy now, so I'm just using 8K. You guys see the export times right here. This one has Resolve, of course. Resolve is the quickest, but once again, we're not seeing a huge difference between the different models. So if you're working with ProRes or ProRes RAW, just get yourself the base model, maybe upgraded 32 graphics cores if you want a little bit more overhead with the M1 Max. You will be super happy. And the last thing we have on our list is Red 8K RAW. Now, as far as playback, unfortunately, none of these systems can play it back perfectly. The Ultras get close, especially in Davinci Resolve, but once you start adding some LUTs, some color corrections, you just don't have enough performance there. Now, as far as the M1 Max, you see it is pretty much half the performance, and that's because this is something that is both CPU and GPU limited. It is very, very tough. And as far as exports, the scaling is also pretty close there as far as improvements in performance. Now, in Premiere Pro, we actually had to go down to a quarter resolution to get proper scaling. In Final Cut and Resolve, you can just go into the 4K timeline and then it will play back smooth as far as the base model. But personally, I would say if you're dealing with 8K Red RAW or the 8K Canon RAW, you just have to get yourself an M1 Ultra. And once again, the extra performance from the 64-core model doesn't give you enough to make it worth $1,000. So unless money doesn't matter, realistically, for these really tough codecs, the RAW codecs, the M1 Ultra $4,000 model is awesome. But for everything else, including your compressed H.264, H.265s, your Blackmagic RAW, if you have ProRes, man, that base model, the M1 Max, maybe upgraded a bit if you want to, is so fast as far as playback, smoothness, effects, all of that. So there you guys go. I hope I made some of you guys comforted if you guys didn't buy the high-end one, because realistically, most people don't need it, especially YouTube creators. And if you're somebody that does want the extra performance, well, hopefully you didn't buy the highest end model because stuff isn't working too well. Now, maybe in the upcoming years, we will see optimizations. Of course, Premiere Pro, you saw in many of those projects, the tough ones, they're just so much slower than the other two programs. Hopefully they improve it some more. And if they don't, well, consider looking at Davinci Resolve. Resolve. It just works incredibly well. So well that it actually doesn't slow down in our torture test and runs at the full 1300 megahertz or right there next to it, compared to dropping down to 900 megahertz for the $4,000 48 core M1 Ultra in Final Cut. So yes, Final Cut is less optimized even for the specific tile memory of the Apple Silicon chips, which is why it's bottlenecked and the graphics are slowing down, than Davinci Resolve. Wow guys, I never thought I would see the day where Apple software is not capable, not optimized well for its hardware, but Davinci Resolve's is. So there you guys go. Thank you for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Click that circle above to subscribe to help us make more insanely detailed videos like this one. Check out one of those great ones right over there. This has been Max, and I'll see you in the next video.